Beloved listeners, I'm about to reintroduce you to an internationally best-selling author, Johann Hari. And it is necessary to remind ourselves that this is not his first appearance. Way back then, he wrote a book which I regard as a masterpiece, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs, in which he gave us the backstory to that war, a war which, like most American wars, Australia joined. And I regard the war on drugs as, well, apart from being a total failure, utterly counterproductive, as one of the greatest failures in public policy in all time. The last time Johann was talking to us, it was about the new Billie Holiday biopic, which is based on, yes, his book, Chasing the Scream. Now to now, if you've ever watched the series Mad Men, the main character, Don Draper, is an ad man in the early 60s, which coincides with my period in that mercenary profession. Draper's job is to creatively problem solve, to come up with ways of convincing people to buy something they never knew they needed. And Draper spends a lot of his time horizontal, lying back on his couch and drinking, while his secretary runs around doing the errands that keep the wheels of his life turning, so that his great mind is free of minor distractions. And in the marvellous way of television, his time sleeping off one too many old fashions helps his mind work away in the background to come up with creative solutions. And voila, he wins the contract and brings in the big bickies. Now, it'd be lovely, I guess, if we all had a sort of a human Siri to attend to dull matters, and time to think more deeply about the many vexed issues we're facing in our modern lives. Enter, stage left, the aforementioned Johann Hari, who wants us to return to a life that allows time for deeper thinking, well, perhaps minus the heavy drinking. He warns that in an age of information overload, we're facing a crisis of stolen focus, which we neglect at our peril. Johann, welcome back. It's been a while. We're talking to you from Miami. Can I ask you to start by summarising the book for us in a 15-second TikTok video?
So one of the highlights of any book tour is always talking to you, Philip. So I'm so chuffed to be with you. I wish we were doing this in Sydney. I guess I don't know if I could do it as a TikTok video, I'm afraid, but I wrote the book Stolen Focus because I noticed that every year that passed, things that require deep focus, that are so deep to my sense of self, like reading a book, watching long films, were getting more and more like running up a down escalator. You know what I mean? Like I could still do them, but they were getting harder and harder. And I noticed this seemed to be happening to lots of people I knew. I was particularly worried about a lot of the young people that I loved who seemed to be kind of whirring at the speed of Snapchat when nothing still or serious could touch them. But I also thought, doesn't every generation think this? Doesn't every generation think, your mind deteriorates and you mistake your own deterioration for the deterioration of the world. But as I started to research this, I started to see some quite striking facts. For every one child who was identified as having serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children in that position. The average American office worker now focuses on any one task for only 3 minutes. So to get to the bottom of this, I went on a really big journey all over the world, from Melbourne to Miami to Moscow, and not just cities that begin with the letter M. And I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on focus and attention. And I used my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to really delve deeply into this science. And I learned from them there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse, and loads of the factors that can make it worse.
Now, take a deep breath, because we're going to wend our way through your minefield. But I understand it was observing your young nephew was a major factor.
There was a moment for me. It was my godson. There was a moment for me when he was 9. My godson, I call him Adam in the book. He developed this brief but freakishly intense obsession with Elvis. I never quite knew where it came from. And what was particularly cute is he didn't know that Elvis had become a cheesy cliche. So it was adorable when he would do it. And every night when I tucked him in, he would get me to tell him the story of Elvis's life. And one night he said to me, Johan, will you take me to Graceland one day? And I said, sure, the way you do with little kids, knowing next week it'll be Legoland or whatever. And he said, no, do you really promise that one day you'll take me to Graceland? And I said, I absolutely promise. And I didn't think of that again for 10 years until everything had gone wrong. So when he was 15, he dropped out of school. And by the time he was 19, he spent literally all his waking hours alternating between Snapchat, WhatsApp, YouTube, pornography. And one day we were sitting on my sofa, and I've been trying to talk to him all day, and I just couldn't get any traction. And to be honest, Philip, I wasn't much better. I was staring at my own devices. And I remembered this moment from 10 years before. And I said to him, hey, let's go to Graceland. And he looked at me blankly. He didn't even remember this, but I reminded him. And I said, let's go all over the South. Let's just break this numbing routine. But in return, you've got to do one thing. When we go, you've got to leave your phone in the hotel. We've got to get away from this way of being. And he promised, and 2 weeks later, we flew to New Orleans. And a couple of weeks after that, we arrived in Memphis. And when you get to the gates of Graceland, there isn't anymore anyone to physically show you around. This is even before COVID. What happens is they hand you an iPad. And the iPad shows you around. You put in earbuds, and the iPad says go left, go right. And there's a representation of every room you're in on the iPad in front of you. So what happens is everyone just walks around Graceland staring at their iPad. And I'm getting more and more tense. And we got to the jungle room, which was Elvis's favorite room in Graceland. And
sorry, I've got to ask, why the jungle room?
Oh, so it's full of fake plants that frankly look like they've had better days. It looks like the invasion of the Triffids, to be honest, but it's lots and lots of big fake plants. It's a kind of fake jungle. And there's a couple next to me, a Canadian couple. And the husband turned to his wife and he said, honey, this is amazing. Look, if you swipe left, you can see the jungle room to the left. And if you swipe right, you can see the jungle room to the right. And I laughed. I thought he was kidding. And I turned and they were just swiping back and forth. And I leaned over and I said, hey, sir, there's an old-fashioned form of swiping you could do. It's called turning your head. Because look, we're actually in the jungle room. You don't need to look at it on a screen. We're literally there. And they backed away, clearly thinking I was insane. And I turned to my godson to sort of laugh about it. And he was standing in a corner looking at Snapchat, because from the moment we arrived, he could not stop. And I went up to him and I said, I know you're afraid of missing out. This is guaranteeing that you will miss out. You are not showing up to your own existence. You're not present at your own life. He stormed off, again, understandably. And that night I found him in the Heartbreak Hotel up the road where we were staying. He was sitting by the swimming pool and he was just scrolling through Snapchat. And I went up to him and I apologized, and he couldn't look up, but he said, I know something's really wrong here and I don't know what it is. And that was when I thought, okay, I need to go on a journey to try to understand what's happening to our attention.
You tell us that we touch our phones 2,617 times every 24 hours. Can this be right?
The figures on what's happened to our attention are staggering. One small study, for example, found that the average American college student switches from one task to another every 65 seconds. And this is devastating for all sorts of reasons. I would just say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's setting up a business, writing a screenplay, learning to play the guitar, being a good parent. Whatever that thing you're proud of is, it required a lot of sustained focus and attention. And when focus and attention break down, as I believe there's strong evidence they are breaking down, your ability to achieve your goals breaks down and your ability to solve your problems breaks down. And in a way, you become a kind of stump of yourself. You can sense what you would have been if you've been able to apply yourself, but you can't get there. That's disastrous enough for individuals, but when you have a whole society of people who can't focus and pay attention, that leads to all sorts of even bigger problems.
You're describing a world with attention deficit disorder.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, Philip. You're right.
Heavens above. Okay.
And what's interesting about that is, one of the things that fascinated me about that is, when I started writing the book, I basically had two stories in my head about why I was struggling to focus. One was my willpower. I was lacking in willpower. I said to myself, you're weak, you're not strong enough. Why can't you resist this? And the other was, I just thought, well, someone invented the smartphone and that did this to me. But actually, when I went on this big journey, I learned from these leading experts and their science. actually that I had a really oversimplified picture in my head. In fact, there's these 12 factors, lots of which are things I didn't even think of as related to attention. The lack of sleep we get, the food we currently eat is hugely damaging our attention. The air pollution we're exposed to is hugely damaging our attention. There's all sorts of factors. But crucially, once you understand these factors, we can begin to build solutions.
I'm sort of gobsmacked by what you're saying. Your interviews led to neuroscientist Professor Earl Miller from MIT, and he reckons we've fallen en masse for an enormous delusion.
Yeah, this was one of the earliest interviews I did, and it was really sobering because he's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. And I went to interview him at MIT, and he said to me, look, you've got to understand one thing about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is just a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not changed significantly in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any time scale any of us are going to see. But what's happened, like you say, is we've fallen for a mass delusion. The average teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time. So what happens is scientists get people into labs and they set it up so they think they're doing lots of things at the same time. And they always discover the same thing. You can't do more than one thing at the same time. What you do is you juggle very rapidly between tasks. You switch from, what was that text message? What's Philip just said to me? What's that on Facebook? What did Philip just say to me? And it turns out that comes with an enormous cost. The technical term for that cost is the switch cost effect. When you
the switch cost effect?
Exactly. So the switch cost effect is when you try to do more than one thing at a time, you will do all the things you're trying to do much less competently. You'll make more mistakes. You'll be less creative. You'll remember less of what you do. And this feels like quite a small thing when you hear about it. But when you look at the evidence, so I'll give you an example. There's a small study backed by a much wider body of evidence, a pretty small study. It was done by Hewlett-Packard, the printer company. So they called in a scientist to come and study their workers. And he split their workers into 2 groups. And the first group was told, just get on with whatever your task is, and you won't be interrupted. And the second group was told, get on with your task, but you're going to have to answer a heavy load of email and phone calls. So pretty much how most of us live. And then at the end of it, the scientists tested the IQ of both groups. The group that had not been interrupted scored on average 10 IQ points higher. To give you a sense of how much that is, if you or me sat down together now, Philip, and got stoned, if we could smoke some cannabis together, our IQs would go down in the short term by 5 points. So this is double the effect of getting stoned. You would be better off.
That was a secret between you and I.
One day we're going to do this.
Put it on air. I'm in terrible trouble now.
I'm just picturing this now. I really want to make that happen. What this shows us is you would be better off sitting at your desk, getting stoned and doing one thing at a time than sitting at your desk, being constantly interrupted and not getting stoned. Now, clearly it'd be better to neither get stoned nor be interrupted. But this is why Professor Miller said, we currently live in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being interrupted. And just to say one other really shocking fact about this, if you're interrupted, and it can be something as small as a text message, according to a study by Professor Michael Posner, it takes on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. But most of us are never getting 23 minutes spare. So we're constantly operating at this profoundly diminished level of brain power.
What does this term default mode network mean?
So the default mode network is something that was discovered by an amazing man I interviewed named Professor Marcus Reichel, and actually came to this science in a slightly weird way. So when I came back from Memphis, I was so tired of being wired that I just announced to everyone. I was in a very lucky position because you mentioned the film rights had sold to my book, so I had a bit of money. I said to everyone, I'm going away and I'm going to be completely off the internet for 3 months. I'm going to have no laptop that can get online, and I'm going to have no smartphone. And I went to a little place called Provincetown in Cape Cod, and I was there for 3 months. And I thought I went there just to get back my deep focus, my ability to read books deeply. And it was amazing to me how much my focus came back. I thought, I've gotten older, maybe maybe my brain's just deteriorated. My attention went back to being as good as it was when I was 17. But there was this thing that happened that really surprised me. So I thought, you came here to, sit all day and read books, to really deeply focus. But I also noticed I started to just go on long walks without, I'd brought an iPod with me. Obviously, it wasn't connected to the internet, and I was listening to audiobooks. And after about a month, I just thought, I'm going to leave this. I'm just going to go for long walks. And I went for long walks, and I started just mind wandering, which is something we so rarely do in our culture. We're so jammed up with switching. What was that? What was that? What was that? We don't even stand in queues for a minute without, looking at our devices. And I suddenly felt this huge awakening from mind wandering. I felt much more creative. And when I left Provincetown, I went and interviewed lots of experts on mind wandering. And that led me to Professor Reichel, who you mentioned, who discovered the default mode network, which some scientists, this is disputed, but some scientists believe is the part of the brain that is active when you're mind wandering. And what Professor Reichel showed is that mind wandering is a really essential part of healthy thinking. When you're mind wandering, it might feel like you're not doing anything. In fact, you're making sense of the past. You're thinking over what you processed. You're making connections between things that otherwise wouldn't be connected. You're anticipating what might happen in the future. And when we're very starved of mind wandering, as we absolutely are in our culture, you actually become more anxious, more brittle. You don't quite feel like life makes sense as much because you haven't given yourself the space to process it. You're more brittle about the future because you're not anticipating what's going to happen in the future as deeply and thoughtfully as you could. So the default mode network and mind wandering are really important parts of thinking deeply.
What you're saying reminds me of an observation I remember of Einstein, who used to let his mind wander nocturnally, and he'd go to bed at night with a problem that seemed insurmountable. His mind would wander, and lo and behold, in the morning he had the answer. Is that one of the advantages of a wandering mind?
100%. And you've also gone to another one of the really deep causes of this attention crisis. So in Australia, in Britain, across the Western world, we are chronically sleep deprived. Only 15% of us wake up feeling refreshed. And I went and interviewed some of the leading experts on sleep in the world. And they explained to me, the evidence on this is shocking. In order to be able to focus and pay attention, you have to get a decent night's sleep. In fact, if you stay awake for 19 hours, which doesn't sound like very long, your attention deteriorates as much as if you had got legally drunk. And I remember when I went to interview a guy called Dr. Charles Czeisler, who's at Harvard Medical School, who's advised everyone from the Boston Red Sox to the US Secret Service on sleep. And he had done this experiment that really haunted me. He was the first person to combine two forms of technology in the study of sleep. There's a technology that can study your eyes, looks at what you're looking, tracks your eyes to see what you're looking at. And there's a technology, of course, that we all know about that scans your brain. What he did is he got tired people who appear to be awake. They're looking around them as surely as you and me are looking around us now. And it monitors their brains. And what it discovered is when you're tired, whole parts of your brain can go to sleep, even as you continue talking and you're looking around. When we say we're half asleep, that is not a metaphor. And a lot of us are living in that state. And Professor Dr. Czeisler said to me, even if nothing else had changed, the fact that we sleep 20% less than we did a century ago, that alone would be causing an enormous attention crisis. And that, of course, is not the only thing that's changed and not the only factor that's bearing on our attention.
Beloved listeners, you're hearing the voice of Johann Hari, and you can well understand why he's one of my all-time favourite guests. One of the disturbing things you looked into is how technology is tracking and manipulating us. Tell us the story of Tristan Harris.
I think Tristan Harris is one of the great heroes of our time. So Tristan worked at Google when they were developing Gmail and lots of other key aspects of how we use our lives, of course, reshaping the whole world. And one day Tristan was working on the program, and one of his colleagues said, I've got an idea, because they were trying to figure out how to get people to pick up their phones more often and use Gmail more frequently. I'll explain why in a minute. And one of his colleagues just said, I've got an idea. Why don't we make it so that whenever anyone gets an email, their phone vibrates? And everyone standing around said, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. A week later, Tristan was walking around San Francisco and he just hears these vibrations all around him, like a kind of weird dystopian bird song. And he suddenly thinks, oh, wait, we did that. And that's happening all over the world. He did a little calculation. He discovered that it was responsible for 10 billion interruptions to people's day throughout the world every day. 10 billion. So Tristan was becoming more and more uncomfortable with what this machinery was doing to people. And he saw that at the heart of it is something that we all need to understand, which is that the current business model for all of the social media that we use and that our kids are obsessed with is very simple. The more often you pick up your phone and the longer you scroll, the more money they make. That's it. That's their business model. Just like KFC's business model is to get you to eat fried chicken, the business model for all of these companies is to get you to pick up your phone more frequently and to scroll for longer. So
he's now co-founder and president of an outfit called the Center for Humane Technology, and at a 2019 presentation in San Francisco, he coined the phrase human downgrading.
He argued that what's happened to us as a result of these technologies are designed to hack and invade our attention. That's what the people involved admit. And I interviewed many dissidents in Silicon Valley, of course, and I spent a lot of time with Tristan. And he argued that what we've done by allowing this technology to do this is we have downgraded ourselves as a species. We've downgraded our ability to pay attention. We've downgraded our ability to collectively take political action. I can explain how if you like. And he argues that we've got to take on, and this to me is really important, for all of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, there are two levels at which I believe we've got to fight. One is defense. There are lots of things that we can do individually to protect ourselves and our children. I'm passionately in favor of these individual steps. I go through dozens of them that I've done myself. I also want to be honest with people. Professor Joel Nigg, one of the leading experts on children's attention problems in the world, says that we need to ask if we're living in what he calls an attentional pathogenic culture, one that is making it really hard for all of us to pay attention. And to deal with that, we're going to have to go on the offense. We're going to have to take on the forces that are doing this to us. At the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us all day. And then that person is leaning over and saying, hey, mate, you know what you might want to do? You might want to learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't scratch so much. To which the response is, okay, I'll learn to meditate, but we need to stop you pouring itching powder all over us. And Tristan has figured out, I think, the key element of how we can do that when it comes to tech. I'm happy to explain it if you like, Philip.
Well, I'd like you to do so, but one of the things he did at that 29 presentation was talk about what is in effect a perfect storm of reinforcing harms, addiction, distraction, isolation, polarization, even fake news.
I think you're absolutely right. And there's several directions we can go in talking about this. I think it's worth understanding this isn't just destroying our individual attention, it's destroying our collective attention. And there's a key mechanism that helps explain it. So remember what we've been saying about how these products are currently designed, they don't have to work this way, social media can work differently, but these products are currently designed to try to get you to pick up your phone more and crucially to scroll as long as possible. So the algorithms are constantly detecting, well, what keeps people scrolling? And that bumped into a really unfortunate truth about human psychology. It's a very simple truth. It's been known about for a long time. It's called negativity bias. It's very simple. You will stare longer at something that upsets and angers you than you will at something that makes you feel good. Anyone who's ever seen a car crash on the highway knows about that. You stared longer at the car crash than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the road, right? This is probably for very good evolutionary reasons. It's a good idea to be alert to things that are frightening and dangerous. But when this combines with algorithms designed to maximize engagement, it leads to a disastrous effect. So picture two teenage girls who go to the same party and they leave and go home on the same bus. One of them says on Facebook, that was a really nice party. I had a great time. The other one says, Karen was a total slag at that party and her boyfriend's an asshole and everyone stank. So the algorithms are scanning for the kind of words you're using. It'll put that first update, status update, into a few people's feeds. But the second update, because it's got angry, engaging words, it'll put that into far more people's feed. Because when people see an angry update, they're more likely to stare at it longer. They're more likely to respond by going, what do you mean Karen's not a hoe? How dare you say that? Whatever it might be. Now, that is bad enough at the level of two teenage girls at a party. But that has happened to our whole societies. You're seeing it happen in Australia. Think about countries as different as Britain and Brazil, as different as countries can be. They have both polarized in the same way. When Jair Bolsonaro, the fascist leader, was elected in Brazil, his supporters outside at the election rally chanted, Facebook, 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 because they knew why he'd won, that this was a key factor in why he'd won, because the algorithms rewarded people who were angry, abusive, and aggressive and promoted them into everyone's feed. So we've got to deal with these things urgently because they're destroying our individual attention.
How very Trumpian.
Exactly. Well, it's not a coincidence. I mean, if Twitter had a personality, it would be Donald Trump's personality. But the key thing, I'm conscious that as people hear this, it can feel very daunting because these are really big forces that are harming our individual and collective attention. I think it's really worth thinking about an example in Australian history when there was a threat to attention as big as this, and Australians dealt with it. So you'll remember, Philip, I can just remember it. It used to be completely normal for people to put leaded gasoline into their cars, and people painted their homes with leaded paint, right? This was normal. And it was discovered that exposure to lead profoundly damages people's brains, and it particularly damages children's ability to focus and pay attention. So a movement of ordinary mothers in Australia, in Britain, in the United States, gathered together and just said, no, we're not going to tolerate our children's brains being damaged in this way. And it's worth thinking about what they demanded. They did not say, let's ban all paint. And they did not say, let's ban all petrol. What they said is, let's ban the lead in the paint and the petrol. And in the same way, we don't want to ban social media. We don't want to all go and join the Amish. That's not a desirable state. No disrespect to any Amish people who are listening. I doubt there's many. What we want is to deal with the specific aspects that are harming our attention. So I interviewed, obviously, a lot of the people in Silicon Valley who designed key aspects of the world that we live in. And one of them, for example, Asa Raskin, who designed a key part of how the internet works, said to me, look, when it comes to this aspect of tech that's harming our attention, the solution is very simple. We need to ban the current business model, a business model that is based on figuring out the weaknesses in your attention, hacking them, and selling your attention to the highest bidder is just immoral, inhuman, and we will not tolerate it. So I said to him, okay, but what happens the day after we banned it? Would I open Facebook and it would say, sorry, everyone, we've gone fishing? He said, of course not. They would move to a different business model. And everyone listening has experience of two of the alternatives. One is subscription. We all know how Netflix works. Another is like the sewage pipes. Everyone listening is close to a sewage pipe. Before we had sewers, we had feces in the street, we had cholera. So we all paid to build the sewers together, and we all own the sewers together. Now, it may be that like we own the sewage pipes together, we want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our attention. But whatever the alternative model we choose is, the key thing is when we change the business model, we change the incentives. At the moment, all the incentives are, how do I hack your attention? How do I hack your kids' attention? But suddenly, in these different business models, you become the customer, not the product they sell to advertisers. So they have to ask, what does Philip want? Oh, Philip wants to be able to pay attention. We can design it to help him do that. Oh, Philip wants to be able to meet up with actual people offline. We can design it to do that. But until we change the incentives, and look, these companies are never going to do that on their own, any more than the lead industry was going to say one day, you know what, guys, we've just made enough money. Let's stop doing this. We have to make them do it.
If there was sufficient awareness of lead to get it out of petrol, just as there was sufficient concern about fluorocarbons to get them out of refrigerators and stop the ozone hole getting bigger. You need a collective awareness of the problem. Are we getting there yet?
I think that you've put it really well. I think at the moment, and this is why I've written Style and Focus, and it's the journey I went on myself. At the moment, I think most people are where I was when I started writing the book. That when they're struggling with their focus and attention, they can see it happening to most of the people around them, but everyone's blaming themselves, right? They just think, oh, we're just not strong enough. Why aren't we strong enough? And I would argue that just like, I want to be careful with this analogy, but just like there needed, and of course still needs to be, a feminist movement for women to reclaim their bodies and their lives, I would argue there needs to be an attention movement to reclaim our minds. And just like the feminist movement had to start with consciousness raising. I think about my grandmothers, who I loved deeply, whose lives were so disfigured by sexism and misogyny. They left school at 13, even when their brothers went on longer, because no one cared what girls learned. But my grandmothers had a pre-feminist consciousness. They hated what had been done to them, but they just thought that's the way the world was, right? And then, of course, what happened is the next generation of women realized and explained to everyone else, it doesn't have to be this way. This isn't nature. This is something that was done to us. It's an unjust form of oppression that we can dismantle. And I think we need a comparable consciousness raising moment with attention, and we need a movement, and we particularly need it quickly, because at the moment we're in a race. On the one side, you've got all these factors. I stress again, tech is only one of the 12, but these factors which are profoundly invading our attention, which are only on course to get worse. Paul Graham, one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, said that the world is on course to be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is than Facebook to a child. So on the one hand, we've got all these factors, from the way our food industry works, from the pollution we breathe, to the social media companies that are going to become more invasive. What we've got to have is, on the other side, a movement of all of us saying, no, you don't get to do this to us. We don't tolerate this being done to our children. We don't tolerate this being done to our minds. And it requires a shift in consciousness, because at the moment we're asking for very small things. I think, and the small things are important, and I'm in favor of them, but we need to remind ourselves, we are not medieval peasants begging at the court of King Zuckerberg for a few little crumbs of attention from his table, right? We are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds, and we can take them back from the forces that have stolen them if we want to.
As a lifetime Luddite, I really don't use many of these devices you're discussing. I don't even have a Facebook page, but I am aware of what's happening around me, and it is a slow motion tragedy. An old friend of the program, Oliver Sacks, would be absolutely fascinated by what's going on, wouldn't he?
I think you're so right. And I think about Oliver Sacks and what an amazing writer he is. And I really recommend people listen to your interviews with him on In Bed with Philip. And I think about books, right? So I didn't look up the figures in Australia, I'm sorry, I should have, but for the first time in the history of the American Republic, a majority of Americans now do not read a single book in any given year. The forms of focus...
I'm sorry, not one?
Not a single one. So that's 57% of Americans don't read a single book in any given year. If you average it out, Americans spend 17 minutes a day reading books and more than 5 hours a day on their phones. So you think about the kind of consciousness that comes from the book, a linear consciousness, a consciousness that emphasizes empathy, inhabiting other people's minds, a consciousness that encourages slowness and depth. And you compare that to what the coarsening of our consciousness that's happening to us. To me, I think you're absolutely right. You think about Oliver Sacks and the beauty and profundity of his books, and the idea. I had a heartbreaking experience when I was in Provincetown. There's an amazing secondhand bookstore called Tim's Used Books, and there was a young woman who worked there. It was really clever. She was about 23, 24. And I would go in there every other day to buy a book. And every time I went in, she was reading a different book. One day Dostoevsky, one day Shirley Jackson, whatever. And I said to her, wow, you read a lot. And she said, oh, no, I only read the first chapters. I can't really pay attention beyond that. And I kind of thought, God, this is a really clever young woman surrounded by the greatest works of literature ever. She's got a lot of time to read, and she just can't do it.
I hope she gets on to read at least your second chapter.
I hope so. And I think this is particularly important for young people, Philip, because there's another factor that, for me, of all the factors I learned about, I think this might be the one that made me most emotional, actually, is what's been done to our kids. So there's been an enormous collapse in the ability of children to pay attention. And there's lots of factors going on. But there's one in particular that really haunted me. So I write in the book about a woman, a complete hero called Lenore Skenazy. So Lenore grew up in a suburb of Chicago in the 1960s. And from when she was 5 years old, Lenore would walk out of home on her own and walk to school on her own. It was about 15 minutes away. She'd usually meet up with her other friends. They'd walk together. School would end at 3:00 and she would leave on her own, wander around the neighborhood with her friends, and find her way home when she was hungry a few hours later. This is what childhood looked like for, I'm sure for you, Philip, for almost all humans who've ever lived. That's what childhood looked like. Children played freely together. They ran around. It turns out there's lots of things in that kind of childhood that I write about in the book that are essential to being able to develop an ability to focus and pay attention. And what happened is suddenly, in the space of one generation, that virtually ended. By 2003, only 10% of any American children ever played outside without adult supervision. And the ones who did, I think the average they got was 12 minutes a week. So basically, childhood became something that happened behind closed doors under adult control. And it's produced a generation of children who cannot focus. And I went to see, the reason I mentioned Lenore is because Lenore invented a program that's all about how we can reverse this. Because a lot of people will be listening, there'll be parents, they'll agree, but they'll think totally reasonably, well, if I'm the only parent who lets my child out to play, the child will get frightened, I'll look like a nutcase. So what Lenore does is she goes to whole schools and whole communities and persuades them stage by stage to restore childhood, to let children play outside again. And one of the most moving experiences I had in the research for Stolen Focus was I went to several of her projects, the Let Grow projects. People should look this up, by the way, letgrow.org, the Let Grow projects in Long Island. And there was one young man I met, he was 14, big, strapping, strong 14-year-old boy. Until this program had begun 9 months before, his parents had never let him out of his house on his own. But the program had begun, and him and his friends had started meeting up outside. And actually what they'd done is they went into the local woods and they built a fort together. And as this boy described it, maybe this sounds melodramatic, but honestly, it felt like watching this boy come to life. And they didn't have cell phone reception in their fort, and they still went there. And when he left,
it's not a lack of concentration, but it is tempus fugit. And I'm afraid, Johann, we're out of time. But a wonderful appearance, and I thank you from the bottom of our collective hearts. We've been listening to the formidable Johann Hari, journalist and author now of Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention. And it's published by Bloomsbury, for those of you who remember how to read a book. Good on you, Johann.
Oh, cheers, Philip. It's always a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much.